is Buzz Brockway. I am the Vice President of Public Policy at the Georgia Center of Opportunity. And we are a state-based public policy group, a think tank, if you will. And what we focus on principally are three main issues: education, workforce, and family formation. And the reason we do that is we're kind of center-right, but we draw from research from the Brookings Institute, which is kind of center-left. What they studied and have come up with this program they call the success sequence. And the success sequence says that if you do three things in this order, people who do this will avoid poverty most of the time. Finish your education, then get established in a job, and then wait to have kids till you get married. And if people who do that are almost never in poverty. So what we do at the Georgia Center of Opportunity, obviously when you mention those three things, there's a lot to that. There are a lot of reasons why somebody might not be able to get a good education or get the education that they desire. There's a lot of reasons why there might be barriers to their employment. The criminal justice system, for example, and a whole host of things that could cause people to struggle to get the job that they want. And so we focus on what are the barriers to those things and how can we knock those barriers down. And that's really what we focus on. So that brings us to today. We're going to talk today about the issue of paid family leave. And we've got a superb set of panelists here who are much more versed in this than I am. But our interest in this issue really comes from the fact that more and more the issue of leave and the need for employees to leave to go take care of things that are happening in their personal lives is becoming a serious issue. And so what can we do as policymakers to address that issue and meet that need? For us at GCO, it more and more becomes a barrier to employment and a barrier to strong families. And so how can we help knock those barriers down? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our panelists are going to speak. And then we're going to open it up for questions from y'all here in the audience. As I mentioned earlier, I know we have some new folks coming in. There's a buffet at the end, at the back here. Feel free to help yourself. On the table outside, we've got literature from several of the authors here, and then some of our literature as well as GCO. And if you need a restroom, right out the hall, go outside and go to the left, and right down the hallway is a restroom. So hopefully we've got everything covered here today. So what I'm going to do right now, I'm going to introduce our moderator. And for those of you in Atlanta, anybody who watches Fox 5 in Atlanta, you'll recognize her. It's Claire Sims. She's a Georgia native, a Georgia Bulldog, if I'm correct. So welcome to the campus of Georgia Tech. We're always happy to, except for a certain Saturday in November, we're always happy to host Bulldogs here at Georgia Tech. And we're very excited to have her. Claire has done excellent work on Fox 5 covering a whole range of issues. She was telling me earlier, she was down at the Capitol earlier today. Today is the kickoff of our legislative session here in Georgia, and so she rushed over to moderate this panel, and we're very grateful. So I'm going to turn this over to Claire, and she's going to introduce our panelists today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. So to add a little bit, I do cover the state capitol and politics in Georgia, as well as just state government in general. So I'm really glad thank you for including me today. I appreciate it. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, we have some amazing panelists here. You guys all came from DC. Thank you, and I know you probably had fun on the flight, right, with the weather. So thank you for braving that for us. But each panelist is going to get 4 minutes to just sort of have an opening statement, introduce them, and talk a little bit about this issue. So we're going to start with Mr. Rick Santorum. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to come and talk about an issue that I think is a very critical one. And believe it or not, that Congress actually made some progress on. How many times can you say that in the last maybe 6 or 8 years? I come at it from the perspective I would consider as a classic conservative. I've written 2 books in the last 15 years. One was in response to a book that Hillary Clinton wrote. She wrote a book called It Takes a Village, and I wrote a book called It Takes a Family. And I wrote that back in 2005. And I talked about how as conservatives, particularly during the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, our principal focus was on economics, almost to the exclusion of anything else. And I believe in that. I was a supporter of that, still do believe in it. Trump tax cuts and deregulatory scheme, 100% behind. But one of the things we forget about is that there's more than one form of capital. We always talk about economic capital, and I suspect what you're going to hear from a lot of folks is, well, how does it affect the economy, the business? But of course, America is more than just the economy. And there is something called human capital. There's social capital. There's cultural capital. There's all sorts of capital. And I think one of the things that libertarians/Republicans in particular, the libertarianish version of Republicans, tend to ignore is those other forms of capital and how important they are to economic capital. Because, as I've said many times, you can't have strong economy without strong families. And I think you're seeing that. You're seeing large segments of our population who are not doing well, and that candidates, particularly on the left, are pointing to, saying, see, as I say in one of the chapters of my book, in Blue Collar Conservative, which is a book I wrote in 2014, that a rising tide lifts all boats, except if your boat has a hole in it. And if your boat has a hole in it, then the rising tide, even though your boat, may look okay on the outside, on the inside you're sinking. And it's fine if your boat is sinking and you're in shallow water, but when the water gets high, as it is now, water's good, right? 3.5% unemployment, things are going great. But if you feel you're sinking, even if you're not sinking that much, relative to everybody else, you feel bad. And you say, well, that's, look at the economic, well, people don't look at that. They're human beings. They don't look at numbers to see how they feel that day. They actually look in relative terms in many respects. So one of the things I think we need to focus on, and as sort of a general primer for this discussion, is how we can help what is clearly not doing well in this economy, the American family. Our birth rates are the lowest ever. And you can say, well, how can that be when the economy is as strong as it is? And it is incredibly strong, but we have birth rates worse than the Great Depression. What does that tell you? Does that tell you, well, we just need a stronger economy, we need to cut taxes more? No, obviously that's not the issue. But unless we come up with solutions to how we deal with this, and the reality is that the biggest problem that we're having, and the birth rates are the lowest among moderate and lower income people who are having the hardest time trying to figure out how they're going to raise a family. And those people don't have access to any kind of leave policy, which is a discouragement in many cases. And if you have any doubts about that, and I know my time is up and I try to keep to my time, that look at Hungary. And look what Hungary is doing and the policies they put in place to actually create proper incentives and support for families to have children. They have done a complete 180 on their birth rates and in helping to strengthen and form families in a healthy and productive way. And so I think that's the macro set I would like to say here, and we'll get into the details later.
Okay, our next panelist is Aparna Mathur. Got it right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm big on pronunciations, being in television. She's with the American Enterprise Institute.
Thank you so much to the Georgia Center and to Claire for moderating. This is a great panel because I think this is one of the issues that I have devoted now a significant amount of my time as an economist, but also as a scholar at AEI, a conservative center-right think tank, to looking at why paid family leave matters to conservatives and why it should matter. And when I think of paid family leave, the reason I started looking at the issue was when I was looking at economic opportunity in America. And I was looking at the issue of women's economic opportunity in particular. And realized that, on a lot of metrics, we are stagnating. So if you look at, some of the economic metrics, like women's labor force participation, you have research suggesting that women's labor force participation in the U.S. is stalling or stagnating relative to other developed rich nations. And one of the reasons for that is the lack of access to paid family leave, the lack of access to affordable childcare. And so, you start looking at these issues and you realize that they actually do deeply affect families. It wasn't a big policy issue when we started looking at it, at least when I started looking at it politically. It has been an issue that's been around on the left for a long time, but I think, when we started approaching it by saying, well, I think we do understand the benefits of having access to paid leave, which the left has, talked about a lot. But I think what, our group did together together. So I co-direct the AEI Brookings Paid Family and Medical Leave Working Group, which is a group of people that's left and right, and also just experts and academics who've looked at the issue for a while. We realized that you have to look at both sides of the equation. You have to look at the costs of the policy, you have to look at the benefits of the policy, and you have to make and still, we still felt that there was a good case to be made, both a pro-work, a pro-family case to be made for improving access to paid family leave in the U.S. So that's what we've devoted, the previous 4 years to working on this issue. I've put some copies of the report outside. I think the most striking thing to me, aside from the potential to do a lot more for American families with access to this kind of a policy, is the fact that one of the biggest reasons that I think conservatives should also care about this policy is that the workers who have the least access to paid family and medical leave are the workers who are the most vulnerable. They're the most disadvantaged workers. They're the lowest wage workers. And you look across at different metrics of what we think of as paid leave. You might think of it as dedicated parental leave policies or any other type of paid time off. And again, by any metric, the worst off workers, the workers who are the least likely to have any type of access, are the most disadvantaged, are the most vulnerable workers. So I think as a society, as a country that believes in uplifting people, in doing more for people at the bottom, in trying to raise families to achieve their true potential, I think this one policy can make a significant difference, and that's why I'm interested in working on it.
Thank you. Next, we have Veronique de Rugy. I'm using my University of Georgia French there.
I'm very impressed.
Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. So it's very nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I started working on this issue mostly because I was stunned by the sudden rise of support from my conservative friends and free market friends for a federal policy on paid leave. And I don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of the benefit. There is absolutely no doubt that this is a good policy for workers, for women, for children, even for employers who can afford it. But the fact that there's a benefit doesn't mean that there's no cost of having the government provide it. And this is why, after looking at this, or being induced to have to look at it so much in the last 2 years, I remain steadily against a federal provision for paid leave. And there are three main reasons. So the first one, again, it's not the role of the federal government. It's not because there's something that is good or desirable that it means that the government should step in and do it, especially because the government often is a one-size-fits-all. It's a very blunt way to provide something, anything that usually is the role of the government, of the private sector to provide. And so there are going to be distortions, and there's going to be people who had a better deal before who have less, who have something that is less now, and it's often not kind of as a net effect beneficial. The other thing is, in order to really actually defend this idea that the federal government should step in, is like you have to prove that there's a market failure, that the private sector is actually not doing its part. And it's really hard to actually make the case for a market failure. I know that in that report you guys make the case that based on the BLS number, that there's less than 20% of women getting paid leave. But when you actually look at government data about all the different ways that the private sector actually provide a benefit that allows women paid leave, it's north of 65%. And when you actually look and drill down in who doesn't get it, as Aparna said, it is really lower income women, often working in part-time job and hourly job. So in a sense, it makes sense because their employers often are very small and there's a cost of providing it. And these employees also prefer having more cash than less cash with this benefit. Obviously, there's not a one-size-fits-all. Some people may actually be willing. And I hope we're going to be talking about these trade-offs. But I think the most important reason is let's imagine that there is really truly a market failure. We need to think long and hard about the kind of policy we put in place. Because if we make a mistake about those policies, there will be consequences and they may backfire. And in the case of paid leave, what we know from international cases, and Rachel will talk about what we know from the state who've actually adopted paid leave, what we know is not good. It goes in the opposite direction of what you want. It doesn't mean that there are not some positive things. Let's take Denmark, for instance. I mean, Denmark is always put up by Bernie Sanders and many others as the place for family-friendly policy. And certainly they have a 52-week policy for paid leave, and it's gender neutral, even though most women, it's more the women who are taking it. And there's a recent study that came out looking specifically at Denmark and all the aspects of these policy, and show a causation between the fact that while before having children, men and women were on the same earning path, after they have children, women's earnings start dropping, and the gap becomes 30% lower. Men's earnings are fine. The other thing that you find is actually promotion of women is harder in countries with very friendly family policies. They work fewer hours when they're employed. So you have to, and these are experiences that have been, and data that show themselves in every study internationally. It does not mean, again, that some women would rather face these type of distortions and get the leave. But as a net, often we fail to talk about the cost of these policies. And that is a real concern. The other thing is, like, make no mistake, I know that in the policy world and in politics, people tend to talk about the benefits of a policy and never talk about the costs. So they're the unseen costs, those distortions I told you about, but they're actually real costs too, because most of these policies are paid for with a payroll tax. And I cannot imagine, if you're trying to help lower income workers, I cannot imagine a worse way of paying for it, because we can have conversation about how the cost is distributed when it's on the employer side or the employee side, but the bottom line is that a payroll tax is always on the back of the employees, and it leads to lower cash benefits, lower take-home pay, and also lower wages, I mean, overall, whether on both sides. We can talk about these things. And so, I mean, there are real concern about this. And while we may like the benefits, let's not forget all the costs. And I will leave you with one final thing. Conservatives like civil society. We believe in strong communities. Family is part of it. Civil society is this thing that we do together, these responsibility that we have, these institutions that we have. And part of it is also employers providing these benefits, certainly because they benefit from them, but also because it's good for them and for their employees. This is civil society, it's part of it. Well, what we know is when the government intervenes, civil society shrinks. And we know, we've seen it in studies. Places where there was vibrant provision of a benefit, like paid leave, once the government steps in, businesses stop providing their benefits or provide less of them. That is something that we need to think about. Thank you.
And we will. Now, finally, is Rachel Greszler with the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I believe strongly in paid family leave, and I think it's a wonderful thing. You know, families are the foundation of society, and it's important that they should be able to care for one another. And that's why it's such great news that we have seen over the past few years this huge uptake in the number of companies that are providing employer-provided policies. And it's not just the upper tier of earners, it's lower wage workers, it's Lowe's, McDonald's, Starbucks, Target, Walmart that have come out with these new policies. And so we are seeing expansion there. And I fear that a government program stepping in now could sidestep that and prevent more growth that would otherwise occur. But even with that expansion, we have to acknowledge that there are people who don't have access to that paid family leave anymore. And I don't think that any of us want to have a case where a mother has to go back to work after a week after having a child. And so then there's the question, is there a government role here? And two things that I would like to look at when we examine that is, could a government program actually meet workers' needs in a better way than employer-provided policies? And then can it actually reach those unmet needs that we're talking about, the lower wage workers or those who are working for smaller companies? Can it reach them and do it in a fair way and an efficient way? So on the first question here of, would a government program actually work for workers? I've taken quite a few leaves myself, and the benefit of that is being able to work directly with your employer. I don't think that a lot of people realize actually only 1 out of every 5 leaves that are taken is to care for a new child. The majority of them are when workers take leave for their own medical need, as well as caring for a sick family member. So we have to think about those other cases, that 4 out of 5, when it might not be an anticipated leave. And it's not something where you have the time, maybe it's an accident, and you have to leave work quickly. You don't have the time to go to the doctor, get the paperwork filled out, submit it to your office, go through the government bureaucratic agency, wait a couple weeks, maybe a month or more to see if you actually are going to get benefits, and then wait for those benefits to start flowing. And that's why I think the employer-provided side is where we would love to see more growth instead. And also, a government program is probably not going to be enough for some workers. If you're diagnosed with cancer or you have a child who is, 12 weeks off is not what you need. You need to work on a package, whether it's more flexible hours, a change in the type of work you're doing, or being able to do some telework and kind of take that leave intermittently as needed. You know, a government program can't do that, and that has been one of the criticisms of programs in Europe, is that they force workers to step out entirely for that period, and they don't allow you to do any work to kind of keep your foot in the door and to keep an easier transition for both the worker and the employer. And that's, you know, logical. If it is a government program and taxpayers are paying for it, then you don't want to be subsidizing a private employer by paying that individual to be on leave, but to also be doing work. And so this kind of complicates things, and I just get back to how those employers can respond more flexibly and be accommodating. You know, government programs have to be one size fits all, and they are inherently rigid and impersonal, and that's not what I think most workers want. And then on the question of, could a policy meet those unmet needs and do so in a fair and efficient way? We have tons of government programs across the world. You know, with the US being the only industrialized country that doesn't have one, we can look to those other countries, and we can look to the 9 states in the US that now have these policies. And we consistently see that the costs actually increase, and they aren't able to meet those needs the way that we envision they would. And so if you look at academic studies of these programs, they actually show that they're highly regressive. They're shifting resources from lower income workers and families to middle and upper income earner ones. And you know, I can cite all these studies, but it's things like saying that they exacerbate class inequality. They are a subsidy to middle and upper income earners while taking resources from lower income ones who don't use them. In California, mothers in the top income bracket are 5 times as likely to receive benefits as those in the lowest income bracket. And California's program has also led to lower wages and higher unemployment for the women who have taken it. And so these are not the types of outcomes that we want to see. And it's somewhat obvious if you look at how does this actually work for lower income earners, and we're talking about what the Democrats have proposed, a 66% subsidy. If you're making $15 an hour and getting $600 a week, you can't pay the bills with $396. And so you don't use that program at all, and yet you're taxed to support it. There's also significantly lower awareness of these programs among lower income individuals. In New Jersey, the program seems pretty low cost right now, but that's because only 12% of parents that are eligible for it use it, and only 1% of individuals that could take it for family or for their own needs are using these programs. And so I think we've vastly underestimated what the true costs of these programs would be. And so if we don't see this as a solution, and you know, I think it would end up being another middle-class unfunded entitlement program in the US. That's not what we need. And then one last consideration that I just want to throw out there in terms of talking about families and wanting to strengthen families, there is the potential for this to become a welfare program that ends up weakening families instead of strengthening them, because what we're talking about doing is paying individuals to perform their family roles. And by doing that, you have a difference between single earner families and dual earner families, and you're inherently subsidizing those dual earner families and taxing more highly those single earner ones that are going to be less likely to use the program. And we're also saying effectively that society places a positive value on Veronique's ability to stay home with her child if she's participating in the labor market, but they place no value on mine if I'm not participating in the labor market. If I'm a stay-at-home mom, she's going to receive money from taxpayers. I'm not. We're going to be doing the exact same thing. And it's the same case when you look at medical care and other situations. And so I do think we need to think through those things and what that's going to end up in the long run in terms of whether it's going to strengthen families or weaken them.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so this looks like a very smart group. Everybody here is here because they're interested in this issue. But I do think it's always important to start with a baseline. So let's talk, what is paid family leave versus paid parental leave? So if somebody would like to take on those definitions, whoever.
Since I have the mic, I guess I'll go ahead. So there are differences, and most of the proposals out there from conservatives are talking about paid parental leave. And so that is for a mother or a new father to take time off after the birth of a child or the adoption of a child. And as I mentioned, that's about 1 out of every 5 leaves that are taken. Paid family and medical leave covers a worker's own need to take leave or that to care for a family member. I believe that about 55% of leaves are for a worker's own needs and about 25 are for caring for a family member.
Okay, and I also would like us to talk about FMLA and what that means. So FMLA, somebody want to go ahead?
Right, so let's talk a little bit about the landscape of who has access to leave and what policies do we currently have in the U.S. So in 1993, government passed the Family and Medical Leave Act, which is basically 12 weeks of job-protected but unpaid leave that is allowed for any of the 3 reasons that we just mentioned. You can take it for parental leave, you can take it for caregiving leave for a family member, or for medical leave for your own needs. On top of the unpaid leave, in 2004, California was the first state to get a paid leave program, which was the first state to do it. Since then, we've had a few other states step in. So we had New Jersey, and then Rhode Island come in with their programs. And then more recently, over the last 2 years, a lot of other states have adopted policies relating to paid leave. So Washington State, DC now has a program. New York has a program. I think the interesting thing is that every state program is different. Some states, so California, when it started, had a 6-week paid leave policy with a 55% wage replacement rate that did not come with job protection. So the only way you could qualify for job protection was if you qualified for the 1993 FMLA. The 1993 FMLA is only available to you if you work at a relatively large business with more than 50 employees, if you have sufficient tenure with your employer, and certain other restrictions. And so what the data show in terms of access is that about 60% of workers nationwide have access to the unpaid but job-protected 12 weeks of leave through the FMLA. And then the statistics on paid leave are far lower. So, Veronique and Rachel are correct. If you look at just the parental and family care piece, at least data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that access is only about 17 to 20% of workers. If you look at medical leave, which is more broadly available, which is available through employers, a lot of employers have either sick days or short-term disability insurance, or states have, their own temporary disability insurance programs. That access is a lot higher. So I think it's important when we're talking about paid leave to distinguish between the 3 types of leave, because the need and the gaps in coverage vary a lot. I still think, when you look at parental leave policies, there's a huge gap. A lot of companies, even large employers, don't have dedicated programs for parental leave. They do offer paid time off. But typically, the kinds of programs that we're looking at are offering about 2 to 3 weeks of leave. It's not of sufficient duration. When you look at medical leave, again, duration is a big unknown. A lot of employees have sick days, which are a max of 7 days a year. So I think there are still gaps in coverage in terms of who has access, how much leave can you take, and I think it's important to sort of talk about how do we improve that access and not assume that everybody who needs it has it, and if employers could be doing more, we would be, much better off. Absolutely, if employers could be doing more, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But as I said, since 1993, we are in 2020, we're still debating access. We're still talking about the fact that most workers don't have access to paid time off. This is particularly true for the lowest wage workers. So I think this is a real issue where I do think we need some government intervention.
Okay, you touched on my next question, which is, who would a policy like this help? Because you mentioned a lot of the top income earners, they have these policies at their companies because perhaps they're in a competitive environment where they can choose where they want to work,
Right.
and they can choose a company that offers this type of program. So who are we looking at, sort of filling in that gap for?
Right. I mean, in terms of access, so what we did as part of our work was to say, okay, let's look at workers who are across different demographics. If you're a low-wage worker, what does access look like for you? If you're a part-time worker, what does access look like for you? If you're working at a relatively larger business, what does access look like? So we have an interesting chart in my report. But I think across all of those metrics, the most striking thing is that if you happen to be working at a small business, if you happen to be a low-wage worker, if you happen to have a part-time job, the chances that you would have access to any type of paid leave, and the chance that you would have access to any job-protected paid leave is minimal. It's less than 10% of workers, I think, at that income level who have any type of access. So we are talking about, I agree, we don't want a new middle-class entitlement. We don't want a hugely generous policy. We're not trying to look like Europe. No one in the US is debating a 6-month or a 52-week policy that would cover all workers and be 100% wage replacement. When we talk about the AEI Brookings work, we said, okay, just on parental leave, we are talking about an 8-week policy that would apply to all workers, but with a cap on benefits of about $600 per week, so that it's really targeted towards the lowest wage workers. It's not a policy that, you could be earning $200,000 and have access to the policy, but the amount of benefits you would get would be capped at about 70% of what you were earning before, with a cap of $600 per week. So, you can design policies. I don't want the big takeaway from this conversation to be, the only way to do paid leave is to look like Denmark or to look like Europe. You can design policies that work well within your parameters. You can talk about policies that are 4 weeks to 8 weeks to 12 weeks long, that offer a minimum basic benefit to everybody across the country, but offer more targeted benefits to the lowest wage workers. So I think the conversation has to be focused on designing a policy, designing it appropriately, so it's not hugely costly on businesses, it's not hugely costly on any family, but that still guarantees, minimal level of benefits to anybody who's going through, having a baby in the house, or having, a medical, situation arise in the home where they're either the primary caregiver or they're themselves going through a situation that needs medical care.
Veronique?
So Aparna is totally right that no one is talking about the Denmark or even the French case. Well, I mean, and even in Europe, there are differences, right? There are places where it's mandated. There are other places where it's mandated and the government pays for it. So even there are differences. But the reality when it comes to government is everything that starts small ends up being big. And while maybe it will never end up being like Denmark, you are guaranteed that it will grow. There's a fantastic book written by John Cogan at Hoover called The Road to Good Intentions, and basically documents every single federal programs since the time they were implemented to what they are now. I mean, and you will be stunned how teeny and limited these programs were. So there's that. The other thing is, like, we all agree we want to improve the lives of lower income workers, and there's just no controversy, but there's a real contradiction in then putting in place a program that will actually penalize them in the form of less employment, lower wages, and also understand, again, it is paid for with the payroll tax, for the most part, if it ends up being paid by the programs end up being paid by the payroll tax, and your proposal is pay for with a small payroll tax, which then will expand inevitably when the program expands. And let me explain very quickly, why is the payroll tax regressive? Or because it's a flat rate, and so of course it penalizes people who make less money, right, as a share of their but it's also because even when it's paid from the on the employer side, what ends up happening is that when an employer looks at the cost of an employee, he doesn't just look at the money he's going to give you in cash. It looks at your entire compensation. And if he has to give you more in terms of benefits, ultimately down the road, the share of your wages is going to go down as a share of your total compensation. And so it means that on both sides, the payroll tax penalizes employees, and it penalizes lower income employees more. Because one, they have to send a check to the IRS, and second, they'll be penalized through their wages. And so I want to protect families. And low income earners, but I just don't see that this is the way.
Okay, we're going to go to Ms. Greszler and then Mr. Santorum. Sorry, she flagged me first.
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on some of these points and the low-income workers and whether or not we can design these policies in ways that will actually help meet them. And we have a little bit of experience in the states here. And so New Jersey just recently has expanded its policy. California and New York have also expanded theirs, trying to get to this group of people that we're trying to meet and to provide benefits that are enough to let them be able to take that leave. In New Jersey, as I said, they have very low awareness, very low uptake, and so they've implemented these expansions, and the maximum tax now is projected to quadruple. And in California, you look in San Francisco, and they did this 100% benefit, so that gets at the low-income earner who can't afford to take a 60% benefit. They can get 100%, and still, low-income mothers are half as likely to use the program as the highest-income mothers who probably didn't need that taxpayer subsidy to begin with and probably already get it from their employer. And to the question of who does this actually benefit if we implement a federal program, one of the biggest beneficiaries is going to be those companies that already provide this benefit and those workers who work there, because it's a windfall benefit to them. They're already providing it, and we've heard, testimony from Deloitte was saying at a Senate hearing that they instruct their workers to first apply to the state program if they're in one of those states that has one, and they get all the benefits they can from the state, and then Deloitte tops them off to what they would otherwise have provided. So you can see that money, which is coming from taxpayers across the board, low-income individuals included, are going to be paying for those benefits for middle and upper income earners who already would have had that access, and then the employers are also reaping some gains from that too.
And it doesn't increase fertility in the California case.
Yep.
So from a family perspective.
Thank you. To Veronique's comment about, which I hear a lot, about this is the nose of the camel under the tent, and that this is going to, be, and I have made that argument throughout my political career, and I think it's actually true in most cases, and it could be true here. And I'm not arguing that at all. I think it very well could be true. It depends how you do it, and I think that's really what I've tried to focus on in the work that I've done in this area. Having said that, I heard that argument when I was in Congress for 16 years about trying to do something on healthcare. And that if we spend any money with any kind of federal dollars to try to help people who don't have insurance, that we would have the nose of the camel. Well, we didn't do anything, and the camel crashed the tent. So there are two schools of thought here. We had Obamacare, okay? And so there are two schools of thought, which is you can leave the pressure cooker with the lid on and hope that somehow or another the heat stops, or you can do something to release the pressure and actually focus and target to where you have a manageable situation. You're actually addressing an unmet need where government can do it in an appropriate fashion. I proposed a tax credit. Dick Armey and I proposed a tax credit for the uninsured. It would have cost $3 billion. And many organizations, I won't say which, represented here, came out and said, I can't believe you liberals who want to spend all this money on tax credits. So just understand there is a legitimate argument to be made here, but there's also a counter argument, which is if you don't address this issue, and the American public is increasingly convicted that something needs to be done, and the overwhelming demographic evidence suggests something needs to be done, then something's going to get done. Better structure it the way we want to structure it as opposed to the way they want to structure it. So that's why I've gotten engaged in this, and I think you see other people who are, I think, very, very much conservatives also engaging in this. Secondly, we talked about the Family Medical Leave Act, which passed under the Clinton administration. I voted against it. Okay, so I'm up here as the only person having voted against the Family Medical Leave Act, yet I'm for paid parental leave. I'm not for paid family leave. I'm not for paid medical leave from a federal level, but I am, and every Republican proposal that I've seen is for paid parental leave on a limited scale. Okay, why? Well, number one, as Rachel said, only 1 out of every 5 leaves is a parental leave. So you're not talking about the vast majority of the leaves. You're talking about a very small segment of the population. And if you're looking at it, the best expenditure of money for your dollar, expend it on something that has a huge long-term impact on the economy and the future of our country and the future of families. No offense, but me taking care of my 100-year-old mother doesn't have a huge economic impact. But a mom or dad staying home for the first 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks of a child's life, when that child is forming bonds that are going to affect their mental, sociological, intellectual, there are studies that are now conclusive that these bonding years, bonding weeks and months at the beginning of a child's life is critical for the health of that child and every aspect of that child's health. And the reality is that we can either say we don't care about that and do nothing to try to address that issue, or we suffer the consequences of children with mental or intellectual or social disabilities going forward. And that's why I think it is absolutely essential on conservatives, particularly folks who consider themselves pro-life, which I do, to say, we are going to support parents. You hear this in the pro-life movement all the time. All you care about is the kids. You don't care about the family. Well, I mean, that's a good argument here. Do you really care about the family? Because if you cared about these kids being born, you'd want to make sure that they have a sufficient attachment to a mom or a dad, or hopefully both. And by the way, there's the other benefit of paid paternal leave, which is having fun. And again, studies out there galore about how fathers who take that leave are better attached to their children, forming stronger families, forming connections to their kids. Anybody for fewer fathers in the home? I mean, we're already at 75% of kids in America being raised without a dad in the home at some point in time. So there are logical reasons to do this, but I agree with, look, I listened to both of these ladies, and I agree with 95% of what you're saying. I don't disagree with that, hardly anything of what you're saying, except one thing: don't do anything. And because you can't just step back from this pressure cooker and not address it. And again, if you look at the proposals that have been put forward by Mike Lee, by Marco Rubio, by Bill Cassidy, number one, none of them have a payroll tax. None of them. I wouldn't support one that had a payroll tax. They all use existing benefits that people receive, and they allow that person to be able to forward those benefits from some future time that they would otherwise receive to the time that they choose to use them to stay home with their children. So there's no economic impact on employers, unlike medical leave and family leave, which are unpredictable and uncertain length. Everybody knows when they're going to have a kid. Now, we also cover adoption, so that I agree that would be a caveat to that. But the reality is most businesses, large and small, can plan for this, anticipate this, can deal with it, and we're talking about a limited amount of time, 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks, whatever it is, and we're talking about the individual making a decision about an existing government benefit and taking that benefit now to help them to attach to that child and care for that child, as opposed to some point in the future.
Okay, so Ms. Rugy first, and then I would like us to talk about those proposals in Congress as well.
Yeah,
You
so I was
touched on
actually
them.
going,
Yes.
yeah. So so again, I really want to reiterate, it's not because we're against the government intervention and paid leave that we're not for trying to draft some solutions. For instance, releasing a lot of the constraint that actually prevents more coordination, more negotiation between employer and employees. Ways to have savings accounts that are not attached necessarily to any particular need, where you can put money, tax-free, and then use it whenever you want. You don't have to wait to be in college. You don't have to wait to retire. You don't have to or suffer a penalty whenever you can. And it's been tried in England and Canada, these type of universal savings account, and it's great for lower income people. But I also want to, so it's not like right now we're talking about why we're against the federal intervention in paid leave. It doesn't mean we're against everything or against trying to find a solution, because the truth is there's just the cost we cannot afford. Those low-income families can't afford. And I would now want to touch on the Social Security proposal for paid leave, which I oppose to on several grounds. Well, the first one, again, it's an increase in the role of government in our lives in an area where I think there is no market failure, which doesn't mean that everyone gets it, but at the cost of the provision, there's no market failure. And the other reason is like Social Security is not doing well. It's doing very, very badly. That said, and it's all gonna come to a head in 2035. So add a benefit, yes, add people taking more money in right now. But more importantly, if there's one thing that conservatives should like about Social Security, is actually, it is a form of you work now and you get your benefit later. And what the Social Security paid leave program do is it turns it on its head. And it's basically dessert now, spinach later. And I think this is a relevant analogy because Congress, they're like toddlers. Come on, not you, but pressured with interest groups saying, oh my God, is it so unfair that parents will have to retire weeks later? How long until they crack and say, oh, well, we have to expand this? And by the way, Elizabeth Warren is already saying we should be able to use Social Security now, not just for paid leave. So if you think it's just the head of the camel, it suffers from a lot of the problem. Again, we're not against finding a solution. We want one that will work.
Let me ask you one question, though. If we're seeing lower birth rates, that means less
Yes.
people paying into Social Security.
Yes.
So if we are incentivizing a little bit, let's call it what it is, people to have children who will then pay into that, is it just
So
a
I'm glad.
timetable issue?
No, so I'm glad you asked, because one of the aspects of the California study that everyone, at least in our world, has seen is that actually it doesn't increase fertility. It doesn't give an incentive for women to have more children. And so this is not the way. And by the way, now that I have the microphone, I will say very quickly, the cost of having a child and raising a child paid leave is a small one compared to actually childcare, which is encumbered by so many government regulation. Let's fight for that. And so I think we're kind of overblowing this issue, even though I'm fully supported, like all of you on the panel, of this. And let's talk about the issues that truly affect a lot of people.
I think yeah.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch actually on the issue of crowd out that's been brought up by both Rachel and Veronique. The question is, will having a federal policy actually crowd out employer and private sector policies? I think the answer is no. The kinds of policies that we are talking about in the US, where we are saying, is it going to be a 6-week or an 8-week policy? It really seems unlikely that a lot of employers who are currently offering way higher, the ones who have come up with parental leave policies, they're offering way longer policies. So yes, it's actually a good thing if they, from your perspective. So Rachel's point was that if companies are forced to provide these benefits, they're going to hire women less or lead to more discrimination. If your point is, yes, these same companies are now letting their employees take up the state policy and maybe shortening slightly the duration of their policies, from your perspective, that should be a plus. Because then the cost of the entire benefit provision is not falling on the employer. But actually, if you look at the California programs, a lot of employers are saying that they were not adversely impacted by the introduction of the state paid leave program. They did not, significantly, a lot of employees are not suddenly being pushed on to the state program because, the state suddenly had it. So I think it's unclear right now how employers are going to react. And so I think when you're designing the policy, making sure it's not a super generous federal policy that's trying to crowd out what's already happening in the private sector is important. But also at the same time, setting a base so that even if you're a low-wage worker in a small firm, you can still look forward to that 4 to 6 week policy that lets you take some paid time off, I think is critical, because a lot of the company policies are really for mid and higher income families. I think that's important to point out. I also think Veronique's point about there being no social cost or there's no sort of market failure in paid leave provision is wrong. There is absolutely a social cost that we are not internalizing. As employers, if you're not offering a policy that then makes some people decide, okay, I either need to quit the workforce or I'm going to run back 2 days after having a baby, but then there are longer term repercussions, because if you quit, then you go on to social programs. There's a cost to our society of having these people now trying to access benefit programs that they could have avoided if they continued to be able to go back to the workplace. So I think that's important to point out as well. And thirdly, all the state programs, the research that we find, especially on the California program, does show all the positive effects that we talk about. There is greater engagement in the workforce. Women are much more likely to return to the same employer, to have a career, going forward, to have higher wages 3 years after having a child. There's all the positive health impacts on the mother and the child, and bonding between the dad and the child. So I think we need to look at that side as well and say, well, we can't just be focused on, is this program going to be super costly, and let's not talk about any federal government intervention at all? Or do we say, okay, there is, there are going to be some costs, but there are also huge benefits, and there is a social cost that we're not internalizing. So let's, do an actual evaluation of the benefits and costs, and not just focus on, oh, the government is now stepping in, that's a no-no. I think that's a wrong point to
Mr. Santorum, actually, I'm sorry, it's his turn this time.
Go ahead, you go.
Okay, all right. I will say, though, anecdotally, you did not want me back at work 2 days after I had a baby. Just going to throw that out.
None of us wanted to.
I'll end with talking about some of the policies that have been proposed out there. But I do want to talk about the societal costs here and the value of people being home with their children in particular. And I think everyone up here can agree. I have 6 kids at home, and it doesn't end at 12 weeks. The importance of forming those bonds and being there for those children goes far beyond 12 weeks. The most important formative years are, yes, the first 3, but it goes beyond that. And so we can't say that just because the government steps in and meets this one need, whether it's 6 weeks or 12 weeks or whatever it is, that's never going to be enough. And that's what's happened in Europe, and that's why you see there are countries that offer a year of leave, 2 years of leave. And we can't fool ourselves into thinking that if we just do this one thing only for parents, only for 6 weeks, only a 60% benefit, that it will be enough. It really won't, and you're going to need to expand that over time. I do want to talk about one way that policymakers could proactively do something, particularly for this group of lower income workers. And this is a proposal that's out there by Senator Lee. It's called the Working Families Flexibility Act. And so currently, if you make under $35,000 a year, you're subject to overtime rules. So if you work more than 40 hours a week, you have to be paid time and a half. Well, there is a prohibition among private sector employees to allow those workers to choose, if they work 2 extra hours one week, to choose between having 3 hours of pay or 3 hours of paid time off. And the state and local government workers, they can have this, it's called comp time, and they can say, I'd rather take that paid time off. For some reason, we don't allow private sector workers to do that. So this Working Families Flexibility Act would allow those workers to do that. And by working a couple extra hours every week over a year, you can accumulate weeks, if not a month or more, of paid family leave. And so that's something that we could do without any new taxes, just freeing up more choices to be made. And then talking about the proposals that are out there. The problem I see with the Social Security one is that you're talking about an old age social insurance system and turning that into something that we used earlier as a kind of a social piggy bank. And so society values parents staying at home with their children, and so we're going to let people treat it like a bank and borrow against it, even though the money is not actually there and it's going to be insolvent. But then what's next? There's actually already a proposal in Congress to let students use Social Security now to pay off their student loans. Well, then what about using it to buy a house or to buy a car? And so as we go down that road, I mean, Social Security has only ever expanded over time, and it's the same thing with all the entitlement programs. I think that would actually be the worst program to put a new paid family leave program into. And there are some other proposals out there. There's the child tax credit. It's essentially a borrowing program too. You would be able to get your child tax credit 2 or 3 years worth of it in advance so that you could take time off. The problem I see with that, or just, not even problem, it's a government loan to begin with, but I don't think that it would actually end up helping lower income workers. Part of the reason that they don't use these programs excuse me, is lack of awareness, as I talked about, and there's also just, whether it's a fear or lack of understanding, taxes, you're using the tax system, they don't understand what that is and whether or not you're going to get it back, and when am I going to have to repay this? And so I don't think that it's going to end up helping those individuals. There's just that barrier there to being able to understand and being able to go in and know what you have to do to apply for that benefit. I think it would help middle class and upper class people. I would certainly take it just because it's a subsidy and it's a zero interest loan. So yeah, I would use it, but that's not getting at the people that we really want to.
Appreciate those comments. First off, I would say that the other proposals, like the Working Family Flexibility Act and other things that Veronique has talked about, which she didn't describe in detail, I'm certainly have put forth all sorts of family-friendly policies that are non-government programs to try to help build and strengthen families, and I don't think we talk enough about it, and the fact that we are talking about it in the context of this, I think, is a good thing, and hopefully can be helpful. I will say that to make the argument that these state programs don't affect fertility rates in those states, and at the same time making the argument that everybody here has made, which is those state programs don't work very well and nobody uses them. You can't make the argument that they don't use them and then expect that it's going to have an impact on birth rates. Obviously, it's not if they're not well understood and they're not well used. So, not a good model to base your opinion as to whether these types of things would be used. We do see, and I threw out this country before, but I'll throw it out again. Hungary, Viktor Orban there, who and the Hungarian people have decided that 1.2 or 1.1 birth rates were unacceptable. Went through and have passed a series of bills, and I'm not suggesting that we pass all of them. I don't think we're in the critical state that Hungary is in, but they passed a series of pieces of legislation to do just that, which is to focus in on the early years of childcare and child rearing and baby bonuses and a whole bunch of other things, as you well know. And their birth rate has exploded in Hungary. That has worked and worked very effectively. And so you're right that these state programs have not gotten a lot of attention, and you're right that maybe even people don't know their employers. But if there is a federal program, particularly if it's Social Security or a child tax credit, I have very little doubt that there won't be a big amount of debate about it, and then people won't know about it and use it. I don't underestimate people who have the ability to get money from the government in their ability to figure out what money's available and then use it, number one. And number two, when it comes to either of these, let's take Social Security, and I know that's one that a lot of conservatives have concerns about, and certainly many on the left have concerns about. I will tell you that no one in my my last 30 years or 40 years of looking at Washington, D.C., I can't think of any person who was in Congress during that time who did more to try to fix the Social Security system than me. I mean, Bill Clinton actually invited me to his only Social Security conference in Kansas City back in 1997, where I presented personal accounts for Social Security, was trying to do everything I could. I proposed raising the retirement age, not a very popular thing in the second oldest state in the country, Pennsylvania, per capita, but I did, because I know Social Security is in trouble. And so my thinking is that this is actually an opportunity to actually talk about Social Security in the context of moving, as was originally suggested, having someone take 6 weeks or 8 weeks of Social Security payments and then delaying their retirement by a commensurate 12 to 16 weeks, twice the amount of time. And most people's reaction to that is, well, don't touch Social Security. But if you got beyond that, no one really had a problem with delaying their retirement by 16 weeks at the age of 62. I mean, it's not a big deal to anybody. And so having people actually think about that, talk about it, socialize the conversation, because we are going to have to change Social Security, and part of that change is going to be we're going to have to change the retirement age. I mean, that's just the reality. But no one's talking about it because everybody's afraid to broach the subject. To me, the benefit of this, which we're actually, as someone who's worked on Social Security for 30 years, we're actually talking about something that is an important conversation to have. Yes, it's not about how we fix Social Security, but it certainly could create an opportunity for us to have a discussion where fixing Social Security isn't such a third rail of politics.
Okay, I think we want to get to some questions from all of you who are here. So is that okay? You ready for that? Okay. So we have a question right here. And I think what we're going to do is just, you'll tell me the question, and then for the sake of the video crew, I'm going to repeat your question, and then the panelists can take it. Okay? Go ahead.
I just want somebody on the panel to tell us what federal program actually works. I don't think there's any that work. And they want us to invest in further expansion of the federal government.
Okay, so the question was for any of our panelists, he doesn't believe any federal programs work, so.
I'll use a program similar to this, if you will, and that's the Earned Income Credit. I mean, if you look at the Earned Income Tax Credit, which was put in by Ronald Reagan, if I believe that was right, Ronald Reagan, and expanded by Ronald Reagan, maybe not put in by Ronald Reagan, but expanded dramatically by Ronald Reagan, and then again by President Bush and by other Republicans, which is it's a tax credit to encourage you to work. Okay, it's an earned income credit. Same concept here, which is it's a tax credit to encourage behavior which we think is actually essential for the health of the country. And that is, we want people to work, so we're going to incentivize work. We want people to stay home in the formative time of having a child, so we're going to create an incentive to do that through the tax code. Yeah, is there fraud? Of course. In every program, there's fraud. Are there ways to tighten it? Yeah, there's been proposals how you tighten the Earned Income Tax Credit. But I don't think anybody really questions that the Earned Income Tax Credit has kept people out of poverty, literally millions of people out of poverty, and incentivize work, which incentivizes success, which is incentivizing good things for people in America.
Any tax cut is great.
Well, it's not a tax cut, it's a tax credit.
Save it.
Yeah, completely.
Okay, well, then you're for our tax credit. That's what we're proposing.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the EITC is sort of one of those proposals that has a ton of agreement across the aisles as having worked and lifting people out of poverty and getting them into the workforce. I think the child tax credit has done, in combination with the EITC, has achieved tremendous sort of support for low-income families and also for middle-income families. So I think there are lots of examples before us, I think, of programs that have worked. I don't think we have to look very far. There are obviously the stuff that comes out is what's not working.
I just wanted to comment with the EITC is I don't think it's the best comparison there because the EITC is subsidizing people to work, and we are talking about subsidizing people to not work.
Take care of their family.
No, to take care of their family, absolutely, and there's value to that. But as I said, you're subsidizing a certain group of people and saying you must participate in the labor force for us to say that there's a value for you to stay at home and be with a child or with a parent.
for working moms too. Working moms,
No,
moms
but
stay at homes don't get the earned income tax credit.
The EITC
same thing.
subsidizes everybody who works at the same level. As I said, if I am a stay-at-home mom and Veronique is a working mom, we are going to subsidize her to do the exact same thing that I am not getting paid to do, and we just need to be aware of that. And I don't think that that is something that is going to strengthen families in the long run.
With all due respect, it's the same thing. I mean, the earned income tax credit only subsidizes people who work outside the home. It doesn't subsidize people who work in the home, who's, by the way, just as valuable work.
But if I do enter the workforce, I am able to get that credit. And so you're telling me that if I am pregnant, then I need to go into the workforce and start working so that I can then stay at home, but the programs wouldn't even work that way.
Rachel, if you're in the workforce, you're paying taxes. That's the whole point of a tax credit. If you're not, if you're at home, you're not paying taxes.
But
I
the
don't
single,
get
the
what
single earner families are contributing to the system, and they will not use it at the same rate as the dual earner families. And so they are being taxed, and they.
Both of them will be paying taxes.
Neither are eligible unless you work.
But-
That's the bottom
I
line.
mean, they're both working and they're both paying taxes.
Okay, let's move on to our next question because I don't
I
think
mean,
we're
can
gonna
I
agree on
just
this.
add something on the earned income tax credit? Can you? I mean, it's just like this is one of the things that I find kind of disturbing about the conservative movement these days. Is like let's not. We can talk about the benefit of the earned income tax credit, but let's also not forget that it is done at a tremendous cost. And because it's spending through the tax code, it's social engineering. Maybe it's social engineering that everyone across the aisle likes, but it has a tremendous cost of $66 billion a year. It has disincentive for hourly worker to actually work more. And so I think, like, again, we always talk about the benefits. We never talk about the cost. And, you know,
I just want to make one more thing. Like, if we're talking about the end road here, we say work is good and we want people to work, and so we are going to subsidize that. And taking care of family members is good, and we want to do that, and so we're going to subsidize that. We don't run out of money in the same way with the EITC as we do with, if you paid everybody to stay home and just take care of their family members, nobody is left working to fund that program. And so that's what's the issue here, is that we all agree it's a societal value for families to be there for one another, but there's a point beyond which it's simply not economically viable to be paying people.
No one disagrees with that.
No one disagrees
That's
with
why
that.
we're
It's
very
like,
targeted.
yeah,
Very
it's about
targeted.
targeting. It's about the design of the policy. It's about making sure you have a return to work thing, as part of the program that you're talking about. No one's subsidizing endless days spent at home.
Okay, we had one over here first. Go ahead.
I'm from Foundation for Economic Education, just moved to the United States from Europe, so I know a thing or two about how they do this. Perhaps this is something you could agree on. What is actually the intent of the policy? Now, we know we should judge it by results, but not by intent. But if you could agree perhaps on the intent, then policy would become clear. Because if it's income protection, sure, then rich people will get more because that's how it works. If it's population growth boosting, then everyone should get the same and large amounts of money, sort of like in Hungary. So what is your intent here?
Okay, and again, for our camera crew here, what is the intent? What are we looking to accomplish here?
So for me personally, I'm looking at both labor force participation, but also enabling people to spend time at home when they need to. But having that tension between the two be very real, so that you're not getting 100% of your paycheck if you stay home. You're getting about 70%. That keeps your connection to the workforce going, but at the same time, you feel comfortable taking that time off if it's necessary and something you need.
Yeah, and I would just say I would limit it to the birth or adoption of a child. And I think that's where Republicans writ large are. They are not, and there's a reason for that. And both Rachel and Veronique laid out the reasons, which is most companies have actually fairly good medical leave policies, and the idea that this is an underserved area, I think, is just not true. And the family leave, that is a very sticky wicket with the amount of the unpredictability and the cost it's a much more complicated and expensive and difficult area to get into. And again, I don't think a federal government program trying to address that issue. The beauty of paid parental leave is it is a predictable, by and large, discrete period of time focused on something that is a true societal need, and that is to look. Anybody think that things are looking bright for families in America, raise your hand. If everybody thinks that our birth rates are going to be a sustainable thing for this country, I mean, the very same people who, many of the very same people who argue against this, trying to do something to revitalize the birth rate in this country, also complain that we have too much immigration. I know, I didn't say, that's why I was very cautious in saying most, not all. I did, I know who I am sitting up here with. But many of them do. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't have a dearth in births in America and not have any immigration and expect this country to grow and prosper. It can't. Look at Europe. It can't. And so we have to address this issue, and hoping that the private sector will do it, I think is a bit of a long shot.
And I don't see this as an economic policy issue, because I don't think that we should be trying to legislate major life choices that people make, like the number of children you have or whether or not you have children. I see this as a policy to help workers and help families have the resources and the opportunities that they need to make the choices that are best for their families. And so that's why I think that freeing up those resources is the way to go here.
Piggybacking off of that, if any of you watch Fox 5, I don't know if you do, I had a baby in April of 2018. And while I was pregnant, we fully planned on only having 6 weeks of paid time for me off and my husband getting none. Well, somehow, they changed their policy in the middle of my pregnancy. I got 12 weeks of paid time, and my husband, who also works at Fox 5, got 6 weeks of paid time to be home with me. 4 more women in my department had babies after me, and 3 husbands took time off. So, just some anecdotal evidence. And again, that's the private sector, but just an interesting thought. Chicken or egg, I don't know, but.
Well, actually, you should give a bit more credit to the academic studies that actually control on those fertility things for actually the people taking it. It was not, so I think the contradiction that you said there is of us arguing people are not taking it, and it has actually yet no visible, is not. Should give more credit to the academics doing that.
I tend not to.
Sir in the suit, and then we'll get person next to you. Sorry.
Chamber of Commerce. First of all, fantastic panel. Thank you for doing this and for being here. This is incredible. I have a question. Why, in your estimation, do you think that lower income, I think we said women or families, are not taking advantage of the paid leave in the States? And you may have said this and I may have missed it. I apologize. But why, in your estimation, do you think they're not taking advantage of the States?
Okay, and again, for the cameras, I'm sorry, we have to repeat the question. Why is it that you believe that lower income families are not taking advantage of these opportunities?
There's a whole host of reasons, and I think one of the first ones is less awareness of the program, and so they're less likely to know that the program exists to begin with. And then it's, being able to pay your bills on a partial benefit. And so most of the programs that are out there pay anywhere between 50 to 80% benefits, and a lot of individuals simply can't meet their bills with a partial benefit. There's also evidence that there's more fear of losing their jobs among lower income workers. There's less ability for them to be able to kind of supplement, if they have that partial benefit, to be able to still do some work on the side. And so it's a combination of factors there that all lead to, even when you try to compensate for this and provide 100% benefit and provide funds to increase awareness and have ad campaigns about it, that there's less awareness. One thing I have thought of, though, is if you really want the government to be helping out here in the most targeted way, is those lower income individuals often have some connection to a state-based welfare program, whether they're getting food stamps or something linked to their children in the schools. If you had a program that was limited to those states and that could really say, like, this is the place that you're already used to going to, and here you are, you're making $10 an hour and you're pregnant and you don't have access to this benefit, well, this state or this county has designed this special program or this pool of funds, and here's something you can apply for and receive. That would be a lot different, and it would be more personal and I think accessible to those workers.
Quickly,
I
we're
can
almost
just
out of time.
Okay, if I can just add to that. So we do have like 2 different state programs. California has paid leave, but it doesn't come with job protection. Rhode Island has paid leave and job protection. And what we do see is that there are much higher take-up rates in Rhode Island. It's a shorter duration program, so people are not taking up as long leaves as they are potentially able to in California. But I think a big part of it is if you have job protection, be a part of the paid leave program, you will see much higher take-up
And
rates.
we know that lower income individuals are more likely to work for smaller employers
That don't have job protection.
Okay, our final question.
Oh my God.
No pressure.
Better be good.
So I'm not a reporter. I'm going to go ahead and apologize for my terrible question asking. So I guess this is really for you guys because I'm a little confused. What sort of policy should a federal government implement, particularly with regards to parental leave, right? Because to me, I see federal government as it helps the whole population, right? And the whole population has babies. Not the whole population, but like that's a very generic concern. So can you juxtapose that with a policy that you think the federal government should support versus parental leave? And also like businesses too, like the distribution of businesses and how much money they make affects whether or not that business can implement a paid policy leave. So that has an effect on competitiveness. So whatever, however you want to take that.
So the question is there a role for the federal government here? Does that sound about right? And what kind
with
of
the
policy
paid
could
parental
they-
leave in particular, and I have to acknowledge that that's different than looking at the broader picture. And one of the reasons for not being proactive for a federal paid parental leave policy is that I don't see us being able to stop it at that, because you are always going to have people that say, I need this medical leave for myself or for my family member, but what can we do for those people? Well, there is the incentive already on the private sector side, and I would argue it's strongest for these paid parental leave benefits, because if you're providing that paid parental leave, and this is a young person coming in to look at whether or not they're going to take a job at this company, having that benefit there is really important to them, and they value it. And so you are able to obtain the workers that you need, and you're also able to retain them afterwards. That's why you provide this benefit, so that those individuals will come back to work. And any company that values those workers should know that it's in their best interest to provide it, and that's why they are doing it. But in general, I just tend to think that, particularly when we're looking at these lower income groups, and yes, I absolutely want everybody to be able to take time off with their children after they're born, they're better off having additional income to decide what to do with that than they are to have a program that's available to them if they need it. Part of this comes from working with a lower income family recently, and they came home from the hospital and their stuff was on the streets because they'd been evicted. And so they needed so much more than access to paid parental leave policy. Like, that wasn't even, a thought in their minds. They needed money, he needed a job, they needed a home for their other 3 kids that were there. And so I don't like to think that, this is the only thing that these individuals are concerned about is paid parental leave, because when you actually see those lower income individuals, there are more pressing needs a lot of the time. And when we're talking about a policy that is going to shift resources from them to the middle and upper income earners, it's not actually what's going to be best for them. And so that's one of the reasons that I would like to avoid having a federal policy, and instead move forward with the private growth that's already expanding. Let the states experiment. I just see that as a better opportunity. And I would just comment, over the last year, we've seen the wage growth at the bottom 10th percentile of earners, this is people making about $12 per hour, increase at twice the rate of that, the median. So somebody who has $25,000 in income has $1,500 extra dollars per year take-home pay now. And having the ability to choose what to do with that, instead of having the option of a paid parental policy, I think that's more valuable.
And I know it's these days, it's just, especially in Washington, it's not a very popular thing to say, but I want to remind, there is a place for someone to remind people that this is actually really not the role of the federal government to do. It's the private sector's role. And as Rachel said, if we're going to be entertaining the idea of any government level do it, I cannot imagine a worse player than the federal government. At least let the state do it if they want to do it, and then also let's learn from the way each one of them design their programs. That's it.
Okay, I would just say if we let the states do it, you will see what happens. The only states that'll do it will be the left-wing states. They will not be policies that are positive to business. They will not. I mean, they won't work the way that what many conservatives believes is the best way to do things, which is a much more targeted, limited, individual-based approach, as opposed to a payroll tax or a business tax or some other type of tax that's going to impact the economy and have the effects. Which, I mean, I find it really interesting that they made all the correct arguments about how all these state programs are a disaster and actually help higher income people and hurt lower income people, and their answer is do more of that. No, the answer is not do more of that. The answer is actually get a federal program that doesn't do those things, that is much more focused on individuals as an individual decision as opposed to a broader-based tax. So that's how
I just want to end by saying I think we need to, as conservatives, make the case for a federal policy that does guarantee uniform access across the country to all workers who need it. It doesn't have to crowd out private programs. We all want the private sector to thrive and offer benefits on their own. We want states experimentation, but that doesn't have to come at the cost of a federal policy. We don't have to wait another 20 years for something that would then, guarantee a certain level of benefits to everyone because we're waiting for the states to do it or the private sector to do it. So I think our input has to be in how we design it, what do we do that guarantees access, that ensures uniformity of benefits, but then also let all the other developments, positive developments, continue.
Okay, I think that's a great place to end. Thank you all so much for being here. Can we please give a round of applause to our panelists who braved weather and Atlanta traffic to be here with all of us today? And Buzz, did you have something else you wanted to?
Oh, I just wanted to echo that. I want to thank all of you for being here, and some of you traveled a long way, and maybe it gave you a little respite from escaping Washington, D.C. for a few minutes at least. But I want to thank all of you for...
It feels like Washington.
Atlanta's a lot better. But I want to thank all of you for coming, and I hope what you see here is this is a very critical issue. This is very timely for us to be talking about this issue. And as you can see, there's a wide range of opinions on what it is we should be doing. But I think we all agree that it is a very important issue, and I want to thank all of you for your contributions to this topic and to this very important subject. So thank you very much, and y'all have a great day.